Welcome to DriverDTrains. Thanks for stopping by. I'm your host, DriverD. Our conductor and brakeman, Scratchy-C, is taking the day off and sent an AI-generated replacement to cover today's shift. In my last video, the second in a series, I showed you how to download and install JMRI, the Java Model Railroad Interface, and get started with JMRI's DecoderPro app to create a roster of your locomotives. If you haven't already seen that video, be sure to check it out. In this video, I will walk you through the process of setting up and using custom JMRI throttles to run your trains. This will open up a number of new possibilities for how we can control our trains using not only our computers, but also smartphone apps and physical devices and throttles. In my next video, we will look at some of those possibilities, including how we can use the WiThrottle and engine driver apps with JMRI, as well as a variety of physical throttles to operate our locomotives. All of these videos are part of an introductory series on using JMRI to control our trains. This initial series of videos will focus on JMRI's DecoderPro app and throttles for running our trains. I'll come back to the PanelPro app and turnout control later. Be sure to check this video's description for links to the other videos in the series, as well as the various websites and products I mentioned here. Also, if you are enjoying the videos, please leave a comment and hit the like button. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. It looks like we're on yard duty today, so let's find our locomotive and grab our first cut of cars. Using and customizing JMRI throttles. Now that we've downloaded and installed JMRI and learned how to use JMRI's DecoderPro app to program our locomotives and add them to our locomotive roster, let's take a look at how to use and customize JMRI throttles to run our trains. Here are all the cuts we'll be switching out today. First, we'll start with an in-depth tour of the JMRI throttle window and the various throttle control panels inside the window, along with some of their settings. Next, we'll look a little more closely at how to customize the throttle function buttons and the keyboard shortcuts we can assign to various parts of the throttle, including those buttons. Then we'll look at how to save different versions of our throttles and arrangements of multiple throttles using throttle layouts. Then we'll run some trains. We've got a lot of moves on the switch list, and there's no time to dally. So grab your clipboard and logbook, and let's get rolling. Using and customizing JMRI throttles. Part 1. The JMRI throttle window. Now that we've added some locomotives to DecoderPro's locomotive roster, let's set up some throttles so we can run our trains. We'll start with an in-depth tour of the JMRI throttle window and look at all its parts and settings. Even though we'll cover a lot of ground, we won't be able to look at everything. You can always find the most up-to-date information about JMRI throttles on JMRI's DecoderPro Throttles page. I'll include a link in this video's description. For this video, I will be demonstrating JMRI throttles using a Mac. The throttles work the same on Windows, although some of the computer menus may look a little different. To get started, let's open the JMRI DecoderPro app we installed in the last video and select the roster entry for one of our locomotives. Then we'll select the Throttle button in the bottom right corner of the window. This will open a new throttle window for the selected locomotive. Assuming that we have not previously modified or saved a throttle for the locomotive, this will be the default throttle window. We can also open a new throttle by using the New Throttle command from the Actions menu when the DecoderPro window is active, or from the File menu when another throttle window is already open. This will open a blank default throttle with no assigned locomotive. We'll look at how to assign a locomotive to the throttle using the address panel in just a moment. But first, let's take a look around the throttle window. At the top of the throttle window is a toolbar. We'll look at this more later, but for now, we want to note that the toolbar includes a track power button and emergency stop button. When the power button is green, the track power is on. It's very important that we turn off the track power when editing the throttle, because if we accidentally click in the wrong place or use our mouse scroll wheel, our locomotive may take off unexpectedly at high speed. After turning off the track power, we'll start by resizing the throttle window. We can do this by first making sure to select the throttle window so that it is active, and then moving our mouse to a corner of the window and waiting for the cursor to change to a diagonal double arrow. We then hold down the mouse button and drag to resize the window. We can also adjust one edge at a time by moving our mouse to an edge and waiting for the cursor to change to a horizontal or vertical double arrow, and then holding and dragging that side. One thing to note is that when we resize throttle windows, JMRI remembers the sizes in its global user interface settings, not its throttle window settings. This means that there is no way for us to save a specific throttle window size for each locomotive. Rather, JMRI remembers the size without us having to save it, whether we want it to or not. However, we can have more than one throttle window open at a time, and JMRI will remember the window sizes for each window based on the order in which we open them and how many throttles we have open on the screen at one time. So we can set the first throttle window we open at a time to be one size, and the second throttle at a time to be another size, the third throttle to be another, and so on, and JMRI will remember all their sizes. In the last part of this video, we will learn how to save our throttle window arrangements and assigned locomotives using JMRI's throttle layout controls. But we can't save the throttle window sizes or positions in the throttle files for specific locomotives. Now that we've looked at how to change the size of the throttle window, let's take a look at the various items inside the window. In addition to the toolbar at the top, the throttle window contains 3 separate control panels: a locomotive speed control panel, a function panel, and an address panel. These can all be moved around inside the throttle window and resized as well. We move each panel by grabbing its title bar and dragging it around, and resize the panels by grabbing the marked areas in the lower right-hand corner of the panel and dragging to change the size and shape. Note that it can be a little tricky to grab the area we need to resize the panels, so we may need to try a few times until we find the right spot. When we resize the panel, its contents will move around and adjust to fit the new size. JMRI will add scroll bars to the function panel if needed, but not the other panels. If some of our control panels are outside the boundaries of the throttle window, we can use the Get All Current Throttle Components in Bounds command from the View menu. This will move, and in some cases resize, the individual control panels to fit in the throttle window. However, this may result in some overlapping of the panels, so it is not a perfect solution. You will still likely need to adjust the control panel sizes by hand, but it may still be helpful. The individual control panels can also be closed by clicking on the Close button in the panel's title bar. Note that Windows users should not use the Minimize button on the control panels. So, for example, if we wanted a throttle window with just the speed control and function control panels, we could close the address panel, and we could create another throttle with just the address panel. To reopen a closed panel, we select the throttle window and use the View menu to reactivate any closed panels. Note that the speed control panel is called Control. There is also a speed display panel called Speed that can be activated in the menu to show the locomotive's scale speed, but I have not used it and it is not clear what type of hardware or software setup is needed to support it. Also note that, unlike with the throttle window size, JMRI will not remember the changes to the individual control panels inside the throttle window unless we save them. So let's look at how we can save our changes to the throttle. If we opened our throttle from the locomotive roster and it has a locomotive assigned to it, or if we opened a blank throttle and later assigned a locomotive to it, we can save the throttle to be the standard throttle for that locomotive by selecting the throttle window and choosing Save Current Throttle from the File menu. This will save the throttle with the same name as the roster ID for our locomotive, which we can also see displayed in the title bar of the throttle window. Now, whenever we open a throttle for that locomotive from the locomotive roster screen, this is the throttle that will appear. Every time we save current throttle in this way, it will overwrite our previously saved settings for the selected locomotive's throttle. However, the throttle for other locomotives will not be affected. But we can also save the throttle with a new name or overwrite another locomotive's throttle by choosing the Save Current Throttle As command from the File menu. This will open a Save dialog box that will allow us to name our new saved throttle. We can either create a new throttle with a new name or overwrite an existing throttle with the current throttle settings. So we might choose to save an alternate throttle arrangement that we use in certain situations for a particular locomotive, or we can copy one locomotive's throttle settings to another locomotive. We can even do this using a throttle that does not have a locomotive assigned, such as the default throttle. Note that the saved throttle files are stored in the Throttle folder inside our My JMRI Railroad Preferences folder. We can easily access this folder from our computer by using the File Locations command in the JMRI Help menu and then selecting Open User Files Location. We can then copy, delete, organize, and rename the throttle files if we choose. We can also edit them directly since they are simple XML text files. This can be especially helpful for copying a whole bunch of custom throttle settings, such as function button labels, from one locomotive to another. However, that is a bit beyond the scope of our topic for today, so we'll cover that in a later video. Now let's go back and take a closer look at the toolbar at the top of the window where we used the power button earlier. We have already seen the emergency stop and power buttons. The emergency stop or e-stop button will send a command to immediately stop all locomotives controlled by JMRI. As I mentioned previously, the power button will appear green when the track power is on and red when the power is off. If the button is yellow, it means that JMRI has lost its connection or is still trying to connect to the command station and doesn't know whether the track power is on or off. We have already seen how we can have multiple throttle windows open at the same time. The plus button on the left end of the toolbar allows us to have multiple throttles in a single window. When we click this button, a new throttle will appear in the existing window, and we can assign a locomotive to it using the address panel, which we'll explore further in a bit. We can continue adding more throttles into the window using the plus button. We can cycle through the throttles using the left and right arrow keys. The regular arrow keys cycle through each throttle in the window, while the curved arrows jump to the next running locomotive based on its throttle speed. We can remove a throttle from the window by using the minus button. If we have previously saved a throttle, we can open it into the active throttle window by using the Open Throttle command from the File menu. This will replace the currently displayed throttle with our saved throttle. If there is no locomotive assigned in the active throttle when we do this, the command will open the saved throttle and its assigned locomotive for that throttle. However, if there is an assigned locomotive in the active throttle window when we open a saved throttle, only the throttle arrangement and settings will be changed, and the active locomotive will remain the same. This is another way that we can copy one locomotive's throttle settings to another locomotive. It is important to note that the throttle window will not change size when we open a new throttle into the existing window, so we want to make sure that all the throttles we use in a single window are generally the same size and shape, or at least will fit within the window, or else use the technique I just described to superimpose one locomotive's throttle arrangement onto another. Just to the right of the power button is the Edit Mode button, which looks like it has a magnifying glass and a pencil on it. If we press the Edit Mode button once, we will turn off Edit Mode. If we press it again, we will turn Edit Mode back on. We can do the same thing using the Switch Throttle Frame View Mode command from the View menu. Thus far, we have been working with our throttles in Edit Mode, which allows us to move and resize the various control panels in the throttle window. When we are done editing the throttle, we can turn off Edit Mode, and the control panel title bars and backgrounds will become transparent, and we can no longer drag and resize them until we turn Edit Mode back on. However, we can use all the controls and features in the control panels. One item to note: in order for the function buttons to display properly in the throttle window, we need to make sure that we select the function control panel by clicking on its title bar before we turn off Edit Mode. Otherwise, we won't be able to see whether we have pressed any of the function buttons, although the functions will still work. We can also cycle the Edit Mode button twice to accomplish this. The last button in the toolbar will open the Throttles List window. We can also open this window by using the Show Hide Throttles List Window command from the View menu. This small window, which we can resize, lists all the open JMRI throttles with the corresponding locomotive addresses and the current locomotive speed. If we click on one of the entries in the list, it will take us to that throttle, including any throttles that are in windows with multiple throttles. The Throttles List window also has a toolbar. The first button in the toolbar will open a new throttle window. The E-stop and power buttons are the same as those we have already seen. The last button in the Throttles List window toolbar provides a shortcut to open JMRI's Throttle Preferences setting. We'll look at these in the next part of the video. To close the Throttles List window, we'll click the Close button in its title bar. We've now looked at all the buttons in the throttle window toolbar, but there is one more thing to know about the toolbar. We can move it, or even turn it off and hide it altogether. To move it, we grab the toolbar in an area where there are no buttons. We can then drag it to any of the other edges of the window. If we align it properly, it will snap into place in the throttle window when we stop dragging and release the mouse button. If we look closely, we can tell when we've aligned it properly because we will see the border of the rectangle shape we are dragging change colors. If we release the mouse in another area, the toolbar will become a free-floating panel, which we could, in theory, place anywhere on our screen. If we close the free-floating toolbar, it will return to its previous spot in the throttle window. In fact, this behavior is generally true for all JMRI window toolbars, including, for example, the small Throttles List window we just looked at, and even the toolbar in the locomotive roster window, although I don't recommend you move that one. However, JMRI does not save any of these settings to the throttle toolbars, so when we close the throttle window and reopen it later, the toolbar will return to its original position. We can, however, turn off the toolbars for all throttle windows by changing one of the settings in JMRI's Throttle Preferences. I said we would look at the settings in the next part of the video, but let's try this one now. We can open the Throttle Preferences by opening or selecting a throttle and then choosing Throttle Preferences from the Edit menu. These are the same settings we saw a few minutes ago. If we uncheck the box that says Enable Throttle Toolbar and save the new setting, all our throttle windows will no longer have a toolbar. We can still access some of the functionality of the toolbar, including the E-stop and power buttons, in the small Throttles List window, which we can open from the View menu. This includes being able to select from multiple throttles within the same window, although we won't be able to add or delete them. We can also cycle the Edit Mode in a throttle window by using the Switch Throttle Frame View Mode command in the View menu. And when we are ready, we can re-enable the toolbar in our throttle windows at any time by changing the preferences setting back to its original state. I told you we had a lot of cars to switch, and we're almost done with this cut, but there are a few more items on our list before we move on. Thus far, the names of our throttle windows have matched the locomotive roster IDs of the locomotives we select in the throttle. However, we have a couple of other options we can choose from for our throttle window names. We can choose from these options by selecting a throttle window and then choosing the Edit Frame Properties command in the Edit menu. We can choose to have the title of the throttle window be the locomotive's address, followed by an L or an S in parenthesis, indicating a long or short DCC address, text of our choosing, a combination of both in either order, or the JMRI Locomotive Roster ID, which is the default setting. We might choose to do this to help standardize or simplify the names of our throttle windows if our roster IDs are too unwieldy, or to help with certain types of automations and macros, which is beyond the scope of this video series. Note that JMRI does not save this change when we save our throttles, but does change the setting with throttle window layout files, which we'll learn to use later in the video. Now let's look at one last feature of the throttle window, the ability to display a graphic image background in the window. To do this, we add a graphic image to our locomotive's roster file, as I briefly touched on in my last video, and then change one of JMRI's throttle preferences setting. Let's see how this works. First, let's go back to our locomotive roster and select our locomotive. Then, as we saw in the last video, we select the Labels and Media button at the bottom right corner of the window, just below the Program button. This will open up the simplified editing window that we saw in the last video when we added our locomotive's roster icon. At the top of the window, we'll select the Roster Media tab. We can now drag and drop an image of our choice from our computer onto the large box at the top of the window. JMRI supports several image formats, including JPEG, PNG, and GIF, but you may need to convert your file if its format is not supported. After we add our image to the box, we'll click the Save to Roster button and close the window. Now, we need to turn on the graphic image background with another one of the settings in JMRI's throttle preferences. Again, we can open the throttle preferences by opening or selecting a throttle and then choosing Throttle Preferences from the Edit menu. In the Throttle Preferences window, we'll check the box that says Use Roster Image as Background and then click Save. Now, when we open our locomotive's throttle and press the Edit Mode button to turn off editing mode, we'll see the image we just added as the background of the throttle. Note that in the current version of JMRI that I am using for this video, the background images are being displayed even when this checkbox is off. I'm not sure why. Note that by default, JMRI shrinks the image to fit within the throttle window. As we resize the window, the image resizes as well. We can change this with another one of JMRI's settings in the throttle preferences. Again, we can open the throttle preferences. This time we'll also check the Do Not Scale Image box and save our changes. Now when we open our throttle, we will see the full-sized image in the background, and it will not change size when we resize the throttle window. It may be helpful to resize the image before we add it to JMRI if we want our throttles to be a certain size on our screen. Also, while I have used pictures of my locomotives for the background in these examples, we do not have to do that and can use any image we want. Maybe we'd like to use a railroad logo. Or maybe we'd like a throttle that looks like a commercial throttle. Or maybe we'd just like to create our own look. We can even do all of these at once. The choice is up to us. At last, we have finished our first cut of cars. Whew! It looks like it's going to be a long day. But that's life on the railroad. Part 2. Throttle Control Panels. Now that we've looked at the overall throttle window and its settings, let's take a closer look at each of the individual throttle control panels. The first control panel we will look at is the Speed Control Panel, which is just called Control Panel in the title bar and menu. This panel includes a speed step menu, throttle speed slider, and forward and reverse buttons, along with idle and stop buttons. By default, the Speed Control Panel includes a speed step drop-down menu at the top. Depending on how your locomotive's decoder is configured, you may only see one option, the set number of speed steps currently configured on the locomotive. Just below the speed step menu is the speed slider. This slider allows us to change the speed of our locomotive. There are several different ways we can operate this slider. We can grab the slider and drag it with our mouse, or we can just click our mouse anywhere near the range of the slider and it will immediately jump to that position, even if our mouse is not right on the speed selector. This is one of the reasons why we want to make sure that the power is off when we are editing the throttle window. We can also operate the speed slider using the scroll wheel on our mouse, if it has one. Our mouse does not even need to be in the speed control panel part of the throttle window for this to work. The scroll wheel will move the slider as long as the mouse is anywhere inside the throttle window other than the functions panel. This is yet another reason why we want to make sure the power is off when editing the throttle window. Finally, we can move the speed slider using a variety of keyboard shortcuts. By default, the plus and minus keys on the numeric keypad and the left and right arrow keys will increase or decrease the throttle speed by 1 step. Holding down the control key with the left and right arrow keys, or using the page up or page down keys, will move the speed slider in larger increments. Below the speed slider are the forward and reverse buttons. These will change the locomotive's direction. The up and down arrow keys on the keyboard are also available as keyboard shortcuts for this. Finally, at the bottom of the speed control panel are the idle and emergency stop buttons. The idle button will set the locomotive speed to 0, but depending on how our locomotive's DCC decoder is configured, the locomotive might not immediately stop, and instead might coast to a stop. Note that when we use the idle button, the locomotive's direction does not change. The emergency stop button will command our locomotive to stop immediately, regardless of what speed it was going. Note that when we use the E-stop button in JMRI, the locomotive will reset to the forward direction, regardless of what direction it was previously moving in. There are several keyboard shortcuts for both the idle and stop buttons. By default, both the spacebar and the asterisk key on the numeric keypad will move the speed slider to idle. Meanwhile, the escape key and the / key on the numeric keypad will issue the emergency stop command. These are all the default settings for the speed control panel. However, there are several options and settings we can change, scattered in a few different places. Firstly, the speed control panel has a set of properties we can access by right-clicking in the panel window and selecting Properties from the one-line pop-up menu. Note that just as when we perform a normal left-click in the speed control panel, when we right-click in the panel, the speed slider jumps to where our mouse is. Did I mention that it is important to make sure that the power is off when we are editing the throttle window? Do you need any more reasons? Maybe it's best to click near the bottom of the panel. In any case, when we right-click and select Properties, a small window will open that will allow us to edit some of the speed control panel properties for this throttle. The first 3 round radio buttons let us select how we want the speed to be displayed on the speed control panel. Displaying the speed from 0 to 100% is the default setting. Displaying speed steps will instead show a text box with the current speed step. In this example, where we are using the typical 128 speed steps, the number will range from 0 to 126. We can change the speed using the small arrows on the panel next to the text box displaying the speed, or by typing a number from 0 to 126 directly into the box. We can also use the scroll wheel on our mouse, but the other keyboard shortcuts we used earlier only partially work here. The last radio button lets us display the speed continuously, from -100 reverse to 0 to +100 forward. This is sometimes called a switching or shunting throttle, and is useful when we have to make a lot of slow speed back and forth switching moves with our locomotives. With this type of slider, the locomotive will automatically switch from forward to reverse as we adjust the throttle. As with the default slider, the mouse wheel and all the keyboard shortcuts also work. This is what I use on my small D-Saver switching puzzle layout. In addition to the 3 radio buttons, there are also 2 checkboxes in the Properties window. The first checkbox instructs JMRI to track the speed slider in real time. This only applies when we drag the speed slider with our mouse. Normally, when we drag the speed slider with our mouse, JMRI will not send an update to the command station until we release the mouse. When we instruct JMRI to track the speed slider in real time, it will send speed updates in real time, as we are moving the slider. The second checkbox allows us to hide the speed step menu at the top of the speed control panel. If our locomotives are all configured to always use 128 speed steps, we may as well hide the menu to free up the real estate. If we want to run locomotives with 25 or 30-year-old decoders that only use 14 speed steps, we might want to keep the menu to have that option. Finally, there is a box where we can set a throttle function to switch our speed slider between the default 0 to 100 slider and the -100 to 0 to +100 switching shunting slider. This way we can change the throttle slider on the fly from our throttle or controller without having to go into JMRI. Note that this only works with the default or continuous slider options. It does not work with the numeric speed step display option. Also note that assigning a function button to switch the sliders has no impact on how that function also affects the locomotive. So if, for example, we assigned F1 to switch the sliders, and F1 also activates the bell on our locomotive, then every time we turn the bell on or off, the speed slider in the throttle will switch as well. So we will want to be strategic about which function, if any, we assign to this task, and either select an unused function or a function on our locomotive that we only want to use with the continuous switching shunting slider. This covers all the speed control panel properties we can edit in the Properties window. Note that when we change these properties, we are only changing them for the current throttle and the current locomotive. None of the other throttles are affected. Moreover, all the properties will revert to their previous settings unless we save the throttle. However, once we save the throttle, JMRI will remember the settings for the locomotive we have used. In addition to the throttle-specific speed control panel properties, there are also some additional preferences that we can set in the JMRI settings menu that apply to the speed slider. However, these properties apply to all throttles universally. We can't pick which throttles are affected. We can access the JMRI throttle settings a couple of different ways. When we have a throttle open, we can select Throttle Preferences from the Edit menu. We can also click the Throttle Preferences button in the Small Throttles list window. Finally, we can access the settings from other parts of JMRI by selecting Settings in the DecoderPro menu, or using its keyboard shortcut, Command Comma in this case, and then selecting Throttle from the list of different settings screens. There are two settings here that apply to the speed control panel. The first is Enable Button Icons when available. This will change the forward and reverse buttons in the panel to be up and down arrows, and the idle and stop buttons to be a red circle and stop sign. The second setting that applies to the speed control panel is Use Large Speed Slider and Control Buttons. This gives the speed slider a very different graphical look. It also greatly increases the size of the text if we choose to display speed steps instead of a slider. Again, these JMRI preferences settings apply to all our throttles, not just the ones we currently have open. We have now covered most all of the settings and configuration options for the speed control panel. The next panel we will look at is the Functions panel. This panel lists all the decoder functions for the selected locomotive. Note that by default, the text displayed on the function buttons comes from the JMRI default decoder profile, not our locomotive. For example, the throttle for this locomotive indicates that function F4 is a dynamic brake. However, as I explained in my last video, I swapped F4 with F11 so that F4 is now the independent train brake and the dynamic brake is now F11. If we check the locomotive settings in DecoderPro, we can see that this is the case. However, JMRI does not update the throttle function buttons for us, so we'll have to do that ourselves. We'll learn how to do that and look at the rest of the settings for the function panel in the next part of the video. Before we do that, however, let's spend a moment looking at the last panel in the throttle window, the Address panel. The Address panel lets us select the locomotive or consist we want to control with this throttle. We can do that by entering the locomotive or consist address in the box and hitting Return, or pressing the Set button, or by selecting a locomotive or consist from the drop-down menus. There is also a button to access JMRI's Consist tool to build a new consist, but we are not going to cover that in this video. When we are done running a locomotive and no longer want to control it with this throttle, we can press the release button and the throttle will forget the locomotive settings, although it will still remember some of the throttle properties we set. We can now enter or choose a new locomotive to control with the throttle. Note that if there is a saved throttle already associated with the locomotive we select, that saved throttle will replace the one we have open. If the two throttles are the same, we may not realize that this has happened or notice any difference. But if the saved throttle for the new locomotive is very different from the one we had open, it may not fit properly in the throttle window, and we will need to make some adjustments. We finally finished setting out another batch of cars. These cuts sure don't seem to be getting any shorter. But then, no one ever said railroading was easy. Part 3. Customizing Throttle Function Buttons. Now that we've looked at the different control panels in the throttle window, let's examine how to configure the buttons and options in the Functions panel. There are actually two different places where we can configure the Function panel buttons. Firstly, in the Function panel itself, each individual button has a Properties menu that we can access by right-clicking on it and editing the settings. However, unlike with the other throttle settings, JMRI stores most of the Function panel settings in the locomotive roster file, and in fact prioritizes the roster file settings over the throttle settings. Therefore, JMRI recommends that we edit the function button settings in the roster rather than in the throttle, and if we do edit them in the throttle, that we export our changes back to the roster. We'll look at how to do all of this now. To edit the function button settings in the roster, we first go to the DecoderPro locomotive roster window, select the locomotive which has the throttle that we want to edit, and click the Labels and Media button at the bottom right corner of the window, just below the Program button. This will open up the simplified editing window that we previously used to add a graphic image and icon for our locomotive. At the top of the window, we'll click to select the Function Labels tab. Here we can see the settings for all 29 possible JMRI locomotive function buttons on the throttle in two columns, with functions 0 through 14 on the left and 15 to 28 on the right. Technically, the throttle can have many more than 28 function buttons, but the additional buttons would be used for things like controlling turnouts and routes, which is beyond the scope of this video, so we will ignore those for now. For each function button, we will see a few different settings we can edit. First, we will see the text or label that is displayed on the function button in the throttle window. As we saw earlier, the labels that we currently see here are those that came from the JMRI decoder configuration file, and not those that are programmed on our locomotive. We'll come back and fix that and look at the labels further in just a moment. Next, there is a checkbox called Lock, where we can indicate whether the button acts like an on-off switch or like a momentary push button. When the checkbox is selected, the button acts like an on-off switch, and when we press the function button, it stays on until we press it again to turn it off. When we unselect the checkbox, the function button acts like a momentary switch and is only on while we are pressing it, and then immediately turns off once we stop pressing it. By default, all the functions are of the locking on-off variety, except for the horn in function F2, which is momentary, so that the horn only sounds while we are pressing the F2 function button. Next are two small boxes. These allow us to use a graphic icon for the function button instead of text when we turn on that feature. There are two boxes, one for the icon to use when the function is off, and another for when the function is on. We add these icons to the boxes in the same way that we added a graphic image and icon to the locomotive roster media screen, by dragging and dropping a suitable graphic image into the box. JMRI includes a few sample graphics that we can use to try out. If we right-click on one of the boxes, JMRI will offer to open a shortcut to open the folder on our computer where these samples are stored. We can search through the samples, finding a matching pair that we want to try for a particular function, and drag them one at a time into the off and on boxes for that function. Finally, the last item we can select is which function, if any, switches our throttle speed slider from the default 0 to 100 setting to the continuous -100 to 0 to +100 switching shunting slider as we saw earlier in the video. Note that we can only select one function at a time to serve this purpose, and once we assign a function for this here on the Function Labels tab, we can't unassign the function so that there is none. Now let's look again at the text labels for the function buttons. We can edit these to say just about anything we want, although there is a practical limit to how long the label can be before the text gets cut off. At the other extreme, if we don't enter any text, JMRI will just display the function number of the button. We can choose to hide these empty buttons, as we'll see later. For myself, I like to see both the function number and what the function does displayed on the button, so I typically add the function number to the beginning of each function button's label. Of course, we also want to fix the labels so that they are labeled for the correct functions. For example, on this locomotive, F4 is the function that activates the independent train brake, and F11 activates the dynamic brake. We can look at the Function Map tab in the DecoderPro programming window to confirm how the functions are configured on our locomotives. We can also look at the Lights tab to see what lighting features are present. For example, on this locomotive, decoder function outputs FX3 and FX4 are wired to the ditch lights, while FX5 and FX6 are wired to strobe lights. On the Function Map tab, we can see that FX3 and FX4, which we just saw are the ditch lights, are mapped to function F6 on the throttle, while the strobe lights on FX5 and FX6 are mapped to F5 on the throttle. So back on the Labels and Media Function Labels tab, we can enter this information for functions 5 and 6. Looking again at the Function Map Programming tab, we can see that F7 serves as both the dimmer and the cab chatter function, so we can add that to the button label. Going on in this way, we can update all the function button labels to match how the functions are mapped on the decoder. Once we make any changes to the function label settings, we need to save them by clicking the Save to Roster button at the bottom of the window. Now when we open a throttle for that locomotive, we will see that the function buttons reflect the new settings. Unfortunately, the result is more or less unreadable as each button is a different size and there are a different number of buttons on each line, making it hard to find the functions we are looking for. JMRI automatically changes the size of the buttons within the limits that we saw previously to match the length of each button's text, and there is not an option for us to specify a fixed size. We can get around this limitation by adding some blank spaces to each function button's label. For my Athearn Genesis locomotives with Tsunami 2 sound decoders, I find that about 20 characters is the right length for the button labels, but you may want to try a few different settings to see what you like best. So again, we'll go to the Function Labels tab in the Labels and Media window and add some blank space to each button's label. We'll count the number of characters so each label has about 20 in total. Don't worry if it's not perfect. We'll see how we can tweak the results in a moment. Again, we'll save the changes and open a throttle window for our locomotive to see the results. Things are already looking much better. However, we can see that we still have all the buttons for the unused functions displayed on the throttle. We can hide these with a JMRI Throttle Preferences setting. We'll open that window using any of the methods that we did before: the DecoderPro settings menu, the keyboard shortcut, the Edit Throttle Preferences menu, or the button on the toolbar in the throttle list window, and check the box that says Hide Undefined Roster Function Buttons. Then we'll save the change. Now, when we go back to our throttle window, we will see that the buttons for all the unused functions are gone. Much better still. Now we can tweak the individual buttons to make them line up nice and neat. I carefully counted the first few buttons to make sure they all had exactly 20 characters in them, including blank spaces. Now we can see which buttons need adjusting. We could do this on the Function Labels tab where we were before, but we can also do this directly in the Throttle Function panel. To edit a button's label, we will right-click on the button and choose Properties. We can then add or delete an extra space at the end of the label and click the Apply button to see the results. We can keep doing this until we are happy with that button and then move on to the next. Note that JMRI will center the buttons on each line in the panel window so they won't line up with the ones above until all the buttons on the line are the correct length. but we can generally see which ones are too long and which are too short without much trouble and adjust them accordingly. We can continue in this way until we have all the buttons configured just right. Finally, once we have them all set up just the way we like, we need to save the changes. However, as I mentioned earlier, these function button labels are not stored with the throttle, but rather in the locomotive roster file. Fortunately, JMRI offers a way for us to export the changes we just made in the throttle to the roster file. We do this by selecting Export Current Throttle Customization to the Roster from the Edit menu. JMRI will ask for our confirmation and then write the changes to the locomotive's roster configuration file. Now if we go back to the Function Labels tab in the Labels and Media window and look or count very carefully, we will see that all the adjustments and tweaks we just made have been copied over to the roster. And now when we open a new throttle for our locomotive, all the function buttons will line up nice and neat. Let's look at a couple more tricks we can try using the button labels properties in the throttle window. Some of these tricks are a limited utility, so maybe we should just call them party tricks. In any case, if we right-click on one of our function buttons and select Properties, we will see that one of the properties we can edit is the font size of the text label in the button. This allows us to make the size of the text displayed on this button in the throttle larger or smaller. We can do this for as many of the buttons as we like, but we have to do them one at a time. Again, there are some practical limits to this because JMRI will not increase the height of the button to accommodate the larger text or change the gaps between the buttons to improve readability. We might also need to edit the button text to fit in the button, or if we want the buttons to be the same size as the other buttons. Once we make the changes to the font size and edit the text as needed, we again choose Export Current Throttle Customization to the Roster in the Edit menu. Although the font size setting is not visible in the Function Labels tab of the Labels and Media window, the font size setting is stored in the same roster file as the other function button data. Now, when we open the default throttle for our locomotive, the text displayed in the function buttons will be the font size we set. It is important to note, however, that although we can save multiple throttles for any of our locomotives in addition to its default throttle, we can only save one throttle customization per locomotive to its roster file. So for example, if we wanted to have a minimalist throttle in addition to our default throttle with just the function numbers displayed on the buttons, we could not do that without changing all the button labels in the roster, which would affect the default throttle as well. One way to get around this limitation is to create a duplicate copy of our roster entry just for its throttle settings. This is not a perfect solution, as it can create its own set of challenges, trying to manage multiple roster entries for the same locomotive. Nevertheless, we'll look at how to do this in a future video. There is one more trick we can use by editing the function button properties. Let's take a look at our function buttons again. We can see that we have one extra function sitting by itself in the bottom row. Maybe there is an extra function in the function panel that we don't need. How about this steam generator on F24? As I mentioned in my last video, Soundtracks includes sounds for the steam generator in its diesel locomotive DCC decoders for modelers who want to model running passenger trains with diesel head-end power. However, this model is a GP40-2, and only 3 of the GP40P-2 passenger variants of this locomotive were ever built, and this UP is not one of them. So how about we hide that button? To do this, we'll right-click on the F24 button for the steam generator and select Properties from the menu. Then we uncheck the box that says Visible. When we apply that change, the steam generator function button will be gone. What if we accidentally hid a function button that we didn't intend to? We can get the buttons we have hidden back by selecting the Reset Function Buttons command from the View menu. Unfortunately, we can't save the hidden button setting in either the roster file or the throttle. We can try, but the next time we open the throttle, the hidden button will be back. If we really wanted to keep this button hidden, we would have to delete the button's label text on the Function Buttons tab in DecoderPro's Labels and Media window. We would just want to remember that the function is still programmed in the locomotive's decoder. That about covers all of the text settings for the function button labels. You can see why we reserved an entire section of the video just for the throttle function buttons. But wait a minute, what about those graphic icons we added to some of the function buttons in the Labels and Media window? How do we use those? To use the graphic icons for the function buttons instead of the text labels, we activate the Enable button icons when available setting that we saw before in the JMRI Throttle Preferences window. This was the setting that changed the appearance of the buttons in the speed control panel, and it also changes the function buttons to icons in the function panel for any functions for which we have assigned icons. It's worth noting that each function can either be a text button or a graphic icon, but not both. However, if we wanted, we could have an entire throttle function panel of just icons. It is also important to know that the graphic icon buttons will always be square in shape, regardless of the dimensions of the images we use. However, we can change the size of the icons for any function by selecting Properties when we right-click on the function button or icon, and then editing the image size in the box for that setting. Again, we can save this by exporting current throttle customization to the roster. Now I think we are finally done with the throttle function panel. That was some serious switching we had to do right there. Fortunately, this next cut of cars looks a little bit shorter. Part 4. Using keyboard shortcuts. Now that we've explored all the parts of the throttle window and what they do, let's look at how we can control the throttle using keyboard shortcuts. This will increase the power and flexibility of the throttles considerably because, as we'll see later, we don't have to restrict ourselves to the keyboard to use them. Note that, depending on our computer, some of JMRI's default keyboard shortcuts may not work because those shortcuts are reserved for the operating system. For example, certain function keys may be reserved for adjusting the volume or the brightness of a laptop screen. Fortunately, JMRI allows us to add our own keyboard shortcuts to overcome these limits. We can view and edit all the throttle's keyboard shortcuts on the Keyboard Controls tab in JMRI's Throttle Preferences window, which you may recall there were several ways to get to. For each control, the keyboard shortcut or shortcuts are listed. JMRI can support multiple keyboard shortcuts for each control. To add a new keyboard shortcut for a particular control, we click in the empty box on the right side of the screen in that control's row. We may not see any visible response from JMRI, but it will know where we've clicked. We then type the new keyboard control shortcut we want to use for that control, and JMRI will add it to the list. Again, we can add multiple shortcuts for each control, but we should not use the same shortcut for different controls, as this could lead to unintended consequences. To delete a shortcut, we click on the button with an X just to the left of the shortcut we want to delete. If we accidentally make a mistake, we can click the Cancel button at the bottom of the screen. Otherwise, when we are done with our edits, we can click Save to record the changes. Note that JMRI will also record any key modifiers we use with our keyboard shortcuts, including the Shift key, the Command or Control key, the Alt or Option key, as well as combinations of those keys. Also note that JMRI makes a distinction between the number keys on the typewriter portion of the keyboard and the keys on the numeric keypad portion of the keyboard. JMRI makes extensive use of the numeric keypad, as well as the arrow and navigation keys for its default shortcuts. Let's take a look at those now. The first batch of keyboard shortcuts provide ways to navigate to the different parts of the throttle window. These are probably mostly helpful for various scripting and automation routines, so of limited benefit to us, but there are a few we may be able to use. The C, F, and A shortcuts, along with K and L, might be helpful if one of our control panels is hidden behind another in the throttle window. And the Insert and Delete buttons allow us to cycle through all our active throttle windows, while the Home and End buttons allow us to cycle through multiple throttles in a single window. Overall, these are probably not something we are going to use a lot, but the rest of the shortcuts are going to be very valuable. The next batch of shortcuts are the throttle speed control shortcuts. We looked at these earlier when we first looked at the throttle speed control panel. These include multiple keyboard shortcuts to control the speed and direction of the locomotive, including the arrow keys, the plus and minus keys on the numeric keypad, the spacebar, the escape key, and more. In fact, JMRI is configured to allow us to control most all of the main features of our locomotives using just the numeric keypad. But what if we want to use a keyboard that doesn't have a numeric keypad? Let's add a couple of keyboard shortcuts to control the speed from the typewriter plus and minus keys. We'll click the rightmost empty box in the row for the increment speed control and tap the plus key. Actually, this is the equals key since plus is the shift function, but we don't want or need to press the shift key to increase the throttle, so equals will be fine. Then we'll do the same with the minus key for the decrement speed control. After we save our changes, we can now control the speed of our locomotives using the plus and minus keys on our main keyboard. Or maybe we'd rather use the comma and period keys. Or maybe we'd like to use the I, J, K, and L keys as substitutes for the 4 arrow keys. We can set up almost any keyboard shortcuts we like. And remember, while not technically a keyboard shortcut, if we have a mouse or other pointer or controller with a mouse-type scroll wheel, we can use that scroll wheel to control the throttle speed slider. Finally, let's look at the keyboard shortcuts for the function keys. By default, JMRI lets us control our locomotive's functions using either our keyboard's function keys, the number keys on the numeric keypad, or both. So for example, the F1 key on the keyboard will activate the F1 function on the locomotive. The F2 key will activate the F2 function, and so on. Once we have run out of function keys, we use the Shift key to add 10. So pressing Shift F1 will activate the F11 function on the locomotive, and Shift F2 will activate the F12 function. When we run out of those, we'll replace the Shift key with the Control key to add 20. So pressing Control F1 will activate the F21 function on the locomotive, and Control F2 will activate the F22 function, right up to Control F8 for the F28 function on the locomotive. But even more useful than those, JMRI also allows us to operate our locomotive functions using the number keys on the numeric keypad. So the 0 key on the keypad will control the F0 function for the headlight. The 1 key on the keypad will control the F1 function, the 2 key the F2 function, and so on. And as before, we can use the Shift key to add 10, and the Control key to add 20, right up to F28. Again, we can edit and add more of these keyboard shortcuts however we want. Moreover, we can use these keyboard shortcuts even when the throttle control panel they are set up for is not visible. For example, we could use all the function key shortcuts we just looked at even if we hid the function panel in the throttle window. Together, the keyboard shortcuts allow us to operate almost all of our locomotive's controls from a simple numeric keypad. We'll look at how to exploit that ability using some different types of controllers in the next video. Well, we've sorted through another cut of cars, and it looks like there's just one more to go. Don't get too comfortable though, because it looks like we've still got some tricky moves to complete before we're done. Part 5. Using throttle window layouts. Now that we've had a chance to look at all the parts of the JMRI throttle window and learned how to configure the throttle and use keyboard shortcuts, let's take a moment to understand how JMRI stores the throttle information, as well as how JMRI places our throttles on the screen. We'll also learn how we can save an arrangement of one or more throttles as a throttle layout so that we can control multiple locomotives on our layout, each with its own throttle. As we discussed in the first part of this video, JMRI keeps track of each open throttle window and remembers the sizes of the windows in its global user interface settings. Further, JMRI saves these settings based on the order the windows were opened, not based on what locomotive's throttle is in each window. So, if we have 2 or more open throttle windows on our screen, which locomotive appears in which throttle would depend on what order we select the locomotives and open their throttles. This also becomes a consideration if we want to have throttles of different sizes. We can have a throttle of one size in window number 1 and another size in window number 2, and so on. But we can't have throttles of 2 different sizes in one window. If we know that we want to have multiple options for the sizes and locations of our throttle windows, we should open and configure all of these at one time so that JMRI stores each different window's size and position. Then, when we want to choose a specific one, we just open multiple throttles until we get to the one we want, then close the others. The key takeaway is that JMRI remembers each throttle window as we open it and associates the size and position of the throttle along with any changes we make with that assigned number. JMRI keeps track of these numbers until we close the throttle windows. If we close all the throttle windows, then JMRI will start over at number 1. So if we make a change to the third throttle window we open and then close all the throttle windows, we will not see our change until we open 3 throttle windows again. If we only close some of the throttle windows, JMRI will start at the lowest number closed window. So for example, if we have 3 throttles open and close windows number 2 and 3, the next one we open will be number 2 again. Note that JMRI would get confused if we only closed window number 2 in this example, because the next window it opened would be window number 2 again, which is fine, but then it would open another window number 3 again after that, and we would have 2 window number 3s. I encourage you to experiment with different scenarios such as the ones I have demonstrated here so that you become comfortable and familiar with the way JMRI displays throttle windows. Having 1 or 2 throttle windows open to control a couple of locomotives is fine if that's all we want to run. But what if we have a layout with many locomotives on it and want to be able to control 6 or 8 or more at any given time, each with its own throttle? JMRI throttle layouts can handle that. JMRI allows us to save any collection of 1 or more throttles as a throttle layout. The throttle layout saves all the sizes and locations of the throttles included in the layout, as well as the throttle control panel arrangements and settings inside each throttle. To save a throttle layout, we first open 1 or more throttle windows and arrange and size them how we like. We then choose the Save Throttles Layout command from the File menu and give the layout a name. We should include the word layout in the name when we save throttle layouts to distinguish them from actual throttles. By default, the layouts are stored in the throttle folder, but we could create a layouts subfolder if we wanted. If a locomotive is assigned in the address panel when we save a throttle layout, that locomotive will be included when we save the layout as well. Note that by default, when we save a layout that includes throttles with locomotives assigned, JMRI will also update the default throttles for those locomotives, which could be fine, but also may not be what we want. We can disable this by unchecking the Save Throttles when Saving Throttle Windows Layout box in the JMRI Throttle Preferences settings window. We can open a saved layout by first opening any throttle and then choosing the Open Throttles Layout command from the File menu and selecting our desired layout. JMRI will ask us if we want to close the currently open throttles before we open the new ones, which JMRI calls Replace, or keep the throttles we currently have open and add the saved throttles from the layout to the screen, which JMRI calls Merge. Note that nothing is actually being replaced or merged. This choice just determines which throttles are shown on the screen for this session. There are a few things about throttle layouts that is helpful to understand when we use them so that we can understand why we might not always get the results we expected. As with when we open any JMRI throttle, JMRI will place the throttles we open from a layout in a throttle window and assign that window a sequential number. If we replace the existing open throttles on the screen with our layout throttles, the new layout throttles will be in windows starting from number 1, number 2, number 3, etc. On the other hand, if we merge the layout throttles onto the screen with our existing throttles, they will be numbered starting after the open throttles. So if we have 2 throttles already open in windows number 1 and number 2 and merge 2 more from a saved layout, the 2 new throttles will be in windows number 3 and number 4. However, if the saved layout throttles were originally in throttle windows number 1 and number 2 when we saved them, they will open on the screen where those windows were previously located instead of where we would expect windows number 3 and number 4 to be. In other words, merging the throttle layout in this example with the throttles on our screen will move windows number 3 and number 4 to the locations of windows number 1 and number 2, and likely overlapping the throttles already on the screen in windows number 1 and number 2. As we have previously discussed, JMRI stores throttle window sizes and locations in its user interface settings, not throttle settings. However, opening a throttle layout and merging new throttles onto the screen can change the settings saved in the user interface file, and our throttle windows may not open where we expect them to next time. It's just something that we should be aware of. Also, while the version of JMRI used in this video is opening the layout throttle windows using the window locations from the saved layouts file, it is using the window sizes from the user interface settings rather than the sizes saved in the layouts file. It's not clear why this is happening. This can also cause some unexpected results when merging throttle layouts with existing throttles open on the screen. Nevertheless, JMRI throttle layouts are a powerful tool and provide a quick and easy way to set up multiple throttles to control all the locomotives on a busy model railroad. Well, we've sorted our last cut of cars. The yardmaster is long gone, so let's highball it out of here before anyone finds something else for us to do. Part 6. Let's run some trains. Well, that was quite a day. We didn't go very far, but we sure covered a lot of miles. And we didn't even touch on everything there is to know about JMRI throttles. But now that we've seen some of the different ways that we can customize JMRI throttles to suit our needs, hopefully you have a better understanding and appreciation for how we can use them to control the locomotives on our layout, whether we have just a few or an entire fleet. Check the oil and fuel, top up the sand, and fire up the prime movers. It's time to run some trains. All aboard! What's next? Using the WiThrottle and Engine Driver apps with JMRI. In my next video, we'll look at how we can use the WiThrottle and Engine Driver apps with JMRI to control our trains. We'll also look at a variety of different types of physical throttles and controllers we can use with JMRI to operate our locomotives. In later videos, we will look at some of the additional ways that we can customize and configure JMRI, as well as some of the JMRI features specifically designed for DCC-EX. We'll also look at some tips and tricks for how we can manage our JMRI locomotive rosters. Life is a journey, and when the fast clock is ticking, it's even more important to enjoy every moment. So until then, thanks for watching. Well, Scratchy, did you enjoy your day off? Great! Does that mean you're ready to run some trains? Talk to your avatar. All aboard!